Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to our lecture 8. And in this lecture, we continue with our discussion on the topic that we started, which is realism and anti-realism about economics. We were unable to cover what we had set out to cover because of the limitation that we had. We did not really have sufficient time for us to cover that concept. But just to remind you, we covered actually 3 major aspects of realism. I gave you an introduction. We discussed scientific realism in conventional philosophy of science. And then we looked at the ingredients of a minimal scientific realism, ladies and gentlemen. So in this lecture, we continue with what we call common sensibles and their modifications in economic modeling. But before we go very far, I want to remind you, ladies and gentlemen, the books that you are supposed to read. I asked you to read the book which is published by Silos, that is Scientific Realism, How Science Tracks the Truth. I also asked you to read a book, Scientific Realism and Ontology. I also asked you to read a book, ladies and gentlemen, on scientific realism and some peculiarities of economics. I asked you to read a number of other books that you remember, published by Austin, How to Do Things with Words, and then The Invisible Hand in Economics, again written, and other writings by Basker, ladies and gentlemen. So I know that you are a group of people interested in knowledge. I know that you have been reading and you've been waiting for quite some time for us to meet and discuss these issues, and I must really thank you. I went through the work that you gave me, and it was quite interesting because, again, the work that you submitted was trying to promote the aspect of knowledge. So in this lecture now, we continue with the common sensibles and their modifications in economic modeling. Remember, I have raised a controversy and debates about economics and why some people think that economics and even economists in this case are not doing a good job in as far as modeling is concerned, because there are certain things which are in the minds of individuals, and these things must be modeled. By the way, economics tries to model is to imagine that they're actually dealing with a natural science, so what you call a physical science, like physics and like chemistry, ladies and gentlemen. So now when we say that economics is a science of common sensibles, we actually refer to the various aspects that are covered by economics. You know very well that in economics we cover issues of land. In economics, we cover labor, and those are factors of production. We cover land, labor, and capital. You also talk about entrepreneurship. We also deal with issues of markets. We deal with issues of money. We deal with prices, right? And these are all things that we call common sense. They are common sensibles. When you talk about a private good and a public good, the other day I saw you were chatting and raising issues of public goods and private goods, and that was on the social media. And that was quite interesting, right? But you also have what we call merit good. When you start chatting around issues of demand and supply, you start dealing with the individuals, households, business firms, central banks, government bureaus. You talk about preferences, expectations. You talk about greed and fear. You talk about cost and choice. You talk about budget and benefit. You talk about competition, contracts. You deal with conventions. when you start discussing issues of auction, arbitrage, alertness, risk, uncertainty, you deal with learning, exchange and externalities, property rights and moral hazards. You discuss issues of wages, profits, taxes, subsidies, fairness. We are dealing with common sense issues. When you deal with issues of savings and investments, debt, mortgage, interest, trust, unemployment, inflation, growth, recession, trade, exports, imports, competitiveness, comparative advantage, exchange rate. Ladies and gentlemen, the list is quite long. You talk about GDP, you talk about sustainable economic welfare. None of these things that I've just given you or mentioned, ladies and gentlemen, look like electrons and their properties and behavior. No way. You are not talking about electrons. You are not talking about neurons, right? You are talking about, or newtons. You are talking about issues that are common sense in nature. So there is a long tradition in economics, ladies and gentlemen, of viewing the basic constituents of its subject matter as being familiar to us through common sense experience. And this has often presented as a source of an epistemic advantage enjoyed by economics compared to physics, ladies and gentlemen. So economics then deals with a domain that is more directly accessible through ordinary experience. So we can access those aspects that I've just talked about through what we call common sense, that is through our experiences. And therefore, this has implications, right? It has implications for realism. And the implications are in terms of the fundamental generalizations which are known to us by immediate acquaintance because of what happens. We interact, right? The experiences are right in our minds. So in the natural sciences, they are known only inferentially, right? When we begin talking about electrons, right, you can infer. I know that these things exist in one way or the other, but these things are quite difficult to understand unless somebody brings a microscope or brings a gadget that, again, that gadget, which is technology, will try to show you another technology and so forth. Well, you can't see with your eyes, right? But when it comes to economics, we see these things sometimes with our eyes, but there are also those things which are unobservable, and those are behavior-oriented aspects, and therefore we need to look at what those things are, ladies and gentlemen. So in economics, there is much less reason to doubt the counterpart in reality of the assumption of individual preferences than that of the assumption of the electron. So when you begin giving assumptions of electron, people will doubt that, right? But when you give an assumption that relates to preferences, individual preferences, tests and preferences, we all understand because these are lived experiences, ladies and gentlemen. So note that in this case, this optimism goes beyond mere minimal realism, ladies and gentlemen. So the idea should not be that economics deals with things of which we have, or of which we can have direct sense perception, but certainly the preferences and expectations of economics agents, right, economic agents, are unobservable in the sense of being inaccessible directly by our senses. So we cannot use our eyes to observe these things. They are not really accessible, but we can use our experiences and imaginations to see those particular aspects. And therefore, the models that we develop in economics should be able to capture those things. So the same thing happens, ladies and gentlemen, when we begin talking about multinational companies and the revenues they make, and the institutional constraints they face, etc., etc., etc. But if we go back to our concept of preferences, ladies and gentlemen, preferences and expectations of economic agents, just as money and price or prices, salaries or salary, taxes and tax, right, are familiar parts of our common sense view of the social world within which we live our daily lives. And that introduces the issue of social construction. And in our next lecture, I'll be dealing with the social construction of these things. So these are common sensibles rather than perceptibles or observables in any strict or pure sense, ladies and gentlemen. So the common sensibles involve concepts and inference. I hope you still remember the lecture that we had about a week ago or a month ago when we are dealing with the Laplace's scrutability thesis, right? I hope you still remember that, how you start with the concepts and then you move up to that level. So for scrutability, just to remind you, ladies and gentlemen, these aspects that we dealt with were inferential scrutability, conditional scrutability, and a priori scrutability. So that's why we are saying that the common sensibles, they involve concepts and inferences, refer to Laplace's scrutability thesis and Laplace's demon. I hope you still remember that. Then, of course, the common sensibles also involve cultural meanings, right, and shared interpretations. These cultural meanings and shared interpretations, they involve the unavoidable hermeneutic moments of economics, right? And when we go into the area of hermeneutics, by the way, there is a field that has also cropped up. And this field, by the way, has been there for quite some time now. And that is a field of Hermeneutics Economics, right? And of course, this is a wide spread complex of theory, as you can see, that describe a multitude of markets and market situations interpreted by the concrete meanings of the concrete actors, right? Even when we go into the social construction, the meanings that we attach to these things must be interpreted. So hermeneutics then deals with the understanding and the interpretation of the meaning of human verbal and non-verbal activities and products. So that's why we have what we call hermeneutic economics or hermeneutics economics. So the domain of hermeneutics, ladies and gentlemen, encompasses everyday experiences, what we go through on a daily basis, right? Our experiences in terms of art, our experiences in terms of literature, our experiences in terms of religion, our experiences in terms of jurisprudence, our experiences in terms of the sciences, and more so social and human sciences, and also philosophy of science. So hermeneutics is an important area, and it refers to the processes of understanding and interpretation which are constitutive of the human way of existence. So it's very important for us to interpret and understand these aspects, and that's why we go back to hermeneutics economics, ladies and gentlemen. And I hope you still remember where we picked those aspects of hermeneutics. We picked them at the point at which we need to understand what is going on out there, ladies and gentlemen. So if we go back to the issue of economics, right, I've already told you that we deal with the common sensibles, and we deal with those aspects that encompass our everyday experiences, and they are quite important. So then in this case, when you are dealing with the economics, we discover that is if we go back to our example of preferences, tests and preferences, our experiences and so forth. So in this case, the messy local preferences familiar to us then become transformed into the transitive and complete preferences of expected utility theory. And since you are students of economics, I want to invite you to go and read the expected utility theory, because we cannot now start discussing that in terms of preferences and tests without knowing the expected utility theory. Please go and read, and we shall also have an opportunity to discuss a few theories in economics. So, ladies and gentlemen, our local and flawed expectations then become transformed into comprehensive, rational expectations. And the ordinary mortal person or people like us in this case become infinitely lived agents in some models. So you see, the modeling is done by economists. When you are dealing with the preferences, remember, you are dealing with the experiences, etc., but the modeling will take place. Theories will be developed. And then when that happens, then an ordinary man like me will become infinitely lived agent in that particular model that has been developed. And of course, this is really an important thing that we need to understand. Therefore, ladies and gentlemen, internally structured business organizations with multiple goals usually become modeled as devoid of internal structures. And this has been a practice in economics. Right, you come up with the models, right? You can give the model of an economy, and then you talk about the open economy, and then you start talking about a closed economy, of course making a number of assumptions, right? And that's quite important, ladies and gentlemen. But we are saying that at the end of the day, when we are modeling, right, when we attempt to come up with these theories, right, so these structures of organizations, the structures of the economies, etc., and the goals that economies pursue, and the goals that companies pursue, etc., they become modeled as devoid of internal structures and pursuing nothing but maximization of profits. And that can be really an erroneous situation and position. So that's why we go into philosophy of science, trying to understand the models and critique those models. And we look at the appropriateness of those models in explaining what is happening. And similarly, other models which have been developed on the basis of strategic rivalry between powerful price-making firms, they also become non-strategic, perfect competition among powerless price-taking firms. And again, that can be disturbing at the end of the day. So even the complex structures of international trade, of multiple goods between multiple countries, they also become modeled as perfectly free trade of two goods between two countries with some technologies and same consumer tests and so forth. And that is also erroneous. In other words, ladies and gentlemen, I'm inviting you to revisit the philosophies that seem to guide the development of knowledge in the area of economics. So the epistemic justifications for the kind of knowledge that we have become very, very important. I'm also aware of the fact that mathematical techniques of representations often make the items in such models even more poorly recognizable from the point of view of common sense experience. Remember, we are dealing with the common principles in economics, but we model. Can you imagine modeling common sense? Right, you come up with a mathematical equation, a mathematical technique, right? And you must follow that technique rigidly, and then you must place experiences and behaviors in that model, right? It's not really a very simple thing, as you can see, right? So we need to revisit, and that's why you're talking about realism, right? And at the end of the day, there are certain other ways and methods that have been incorporated in the philosophy of science that can handle that kind of situation. So mathematical techniques of representations, right, often make the items placed in our models poorly recognizable from the point of view of common sense, ladies and gentlemen. So given such theoretical transformations, one may wonder whether economics is really about common sensibles after all. Right, so we know economics is about common sense, but the models that have been used to model the common sense are questionable, ladies and gentlemen. So allow me to, ladies and gentlemen, to somehow summarize that aspect. I will not be closing in the next few seconds. I still have a few minutes left, but I wanted to move on from the common sensibles and move into some other aspects that are very, very critical and very important in the area of common sense that you need to understand. And that's why there is no radical ontological departure from the realm of common sense items when moving from boundedly rational to perfectly rational agents, or from messy preferences to well-defined preferences, or from probably costly transactions to free transactions, and from time-consuming and permanently out of equilibrium processes, or from particular market prices to inflation rates, ladies and gentlemen. But we also know that common sensibles are modified by cognitive operations, right? So we always have the cognitive structures, and this is actually from cognitive science, where you have issues of selection, issues of omission, issues of abstraction, idealization, simplification, aggregation, and averaging. So common sensibles are modified by cognitive operations such as those aspects that I've mentioned, the way you select the items that you should include in the model, the proxy variables, the omissions that you make when you are modeling, the abstraction that you go through, the idealization, the simplification, the aggregation and averaging of issues in that particular model. Because at the end of the day, whether you come up with a complicated model that deals with the inferential, that brings out inferential data or statistics, at some stage you start with the basics and then you go to averages, right? And then you probably have to bring the standard deviation. So you'll find that those aspects are actually incorporated in the in your correlation coefficients and regression models as well. So it is also possible to turn the doubts about common sensibles into doubts about existence, ladies and gentlemen. So that's why we must work very, very, very hard. So those idealized identities can be considered to be fiction rather than candidates for real things, ladies and gentlemen. So the philosophically minded economists will really come up with new suggestions that can help us understand what is happening out there. I'll give you an example of a philosophically minded economist called Fries Matchlap, who has suggested a very simple idea. And his prime example was the neo-classical or marginalist theory of the perfectly competitive firm. So Fries certainly comes up with a few things that he has suggested, and those things certainly refer to the theory of the perfectly competitive firm. So Fries asserts that the theory depicts firms as devoid of internal structures. He also says that the theory depicts firms as perfectly informed. The theory depicts firms as taking price, and these are taken as their own source of information. The theory depicts firms as not interacting through rivalry. The theory also depicts the firm as price takers rather than price makers. And also the theory depicts firms as pursuing maximum profits as their only goal. So you can imagine coming up with these aspects, right? That firms are devoid of internal structure. Firms, perfectly informed. Firms are taking price signals as the only source of information. Firms are not interacting through rivalry. Firms are not interacting. Firms are price takers rather than price makers. Firms pursue maximum profit as their only goal. And this can be erroneous, ladies and gentlemen. You know very well, firms may actually pursue multiple goals. We know that firms may not actually be price takers. Firms may interact through rivalry. That happens quite often. Firms, we know very well, can't, and it's very hard to say they are perfectly informed. And you cannot ignore the internal structures of these firms. So that's why Matchlab's reasoning, or Friez's reasoning, is straightforward in concluding that in the neoclassical theory of the competitive firms, all firms are pure fictions. And that's what he says. So the firms you see there are fictitious firms. They don't exist. So, and that's what he says, that all firms are pure, right? I hope you got me right. Matchlab's reasoning is straightforward. When he concludes in the, he actually concludes that in the neoclassical theory of the competitive firm, all firms are pure fictions. That the theory postulates these purely fictitious and single-minded firms. So that is an observation that we cannot ignore. So again, Friez warns against failing to keep apart these fictional theoretical firms and the familiar reorganizations also called firms. So he actually calls economists to the table for a discussion and tells them to start thinking about real firms rather than talking about fictitious firms, ladies and gentlemen. According to Friez, firms in the neoclassical theory of the competitive firm, they fail to refer to real firms. And that's what we have just said. They are fictitious, right? So trying to model these things, right? And coming up with the results, and you say, you know what, this is what explains this reality, can be erroneous. So in the next few minutes, let me talk about isolation by idealization. Remember, at some stage, I did tell you that there are a number of things that make us fail to achieve results, because common sensibles are modified by cognitive operations like selection, omission, abstraction, idealization, and aggregation, averaging. So I want to tackle this element of idealization in the next few seconds, and then I'll ask you, ladies and gentlemen, to discuss other aspects that will come to the fore. Idealization is very important. Isolation is also another aspect. So here we deal with isolation by idealization. So I'll tell you that in the 19th century economics, it was popular to think of economic theory as focusing on just a limited set of causally relevant factors and to examine the consequences of their functioning in the absence of those factors, that is, in the abstract. But a more concrete account of the empirical world would certainly require incorporating further causes that also contribute to the shaping of the phenomenon. So what happens in this case, many other scholars came up to the fore, and they emphasized different aspects of variations in this overall image of economic theorizing. I'll tell you that in 1832, you have Stuart Mill, who came up with the ideas about the decomposition and the composition of causes. Then Karl Marx came to the fore in 1858, and Karl Marx certainly emphasized a Hegelian dialectics of the abstract and the concrete. Then in 1883, Karl Menger came to the fore and pursued economics as what he called an exact science. In 1890, Alfred Marshall also came to the fore and explicitly employed the ceteris paribus clause and so on. So you know where all these things have come from. So in case you didn't know, that assumption, right, the ceteris paribus, it comes from Alfred Marshall in 1890. So he assumed other things constant, right? So those are the major scholars that have contributed to understanding the image, the overall image of economic theorization. So economic theorization has been informed by John Stuart Mill, 1832, decomposition and composition of causes, Karl Marx, 1858, Hegelian dialectics of the abstract and the concrete, Karl Menger, 1883, the economics as what he called an exact science, and then Alfred Marshall, 1890, comes up with the concept of ceteris paribus, ladies and gentlemen. So economic theories were often conceived in terms of their premises that were believed to be true, even if incomplete, right? So these aspects make certainly modeling a little bit challenging, right? Because of the nature in which economics has been developed as a discipline, ladies and gentlemen. So, in conclusion, right, because I should close at this material time, and then in our next lectures we shall continue with the, that concept of isolation by idealization. I want to say that economics as a discipline has received attention from scholars because of the benefits that have been obtained from the discipline. The discipline is able to explain certainly what goes on in the economy, what goes on in farms, what goes on in contracting, what goes on at the national and international levels. That is true. However, it has also been attacked because of the complex nature of economics, because at the end of the day you deal with issues that cannot be observed. Some issues are considered to be common sensibles, but even then the common modeling common sensibles is very very complex, ladies and gentlemen. So that was the lecture that we have just gone through. We've been discussing realism and the anti-realism perspectives in economics. I have covered so far the introduction, scientific realism in conventional philosophy of science. I've gone through ingredients of a minimal scientific realism. I have also covered common sensibles and their modifications in economic modeling. Unfortunately, we didn't go very far after introducing the concept of idealization. So that's where we shall start and close common sensibles, and then continue with social construction of reality in economics. So once again, I want to thank you for attending. Do not forget to read those books that I gave you. I wish you a nice time. Stay well, stay safe. Bye.